grabbed her wrist across the bar and twisted it, hard, the way a man twists something he thinks belongs to him. And the entire room heard the sound it made, not her wrist, not yet, but the sharp ceramic crack of the coffee mug she'd been holding hitting the bar top as her hand went flat and still and did not pull away. She looked at him. Not up at him, though he had 8 inches and 100 pounds on her. At him. Level. The way a person looks at something they have already categorized and filed. Staff Sergeant Dana Reyes had been buying rounds for his table for 3 hours. He was loud in the particular way of men who spent enough time in uniform that civilian spaces feel too quiet, too unstructured, like rooms where the rules don't apply the same way. He'd been watching the woman at the end of the bar since she sat down. He'd sent a drink. She'd sent it back with the bartender without touching it or looking up. He'd tried twice more with words, and twice more she'd answered in the flat, minimal way of someone who is not being coy, and is not playing hard to get, and genuinely wants to be left alone. The third time, he'd decided that wasn't an answer he was interested in accepting, so he'd grabbed her wrist, and Dana Reyes had gone completely still. Her name at that point meant nothing to anyone in that bar. She was a woman in her early 30s, dark-haired, lean in the way of someone who moves for function rather than appearance, wearing civilian clothes that fit the way civilian clothes fit on people who spend most of their time in something else. She'd been nursing a black coffee for 40 minutes. She hadn't spoken to anyone. She had the quality of stillness that some people carry like a second skin, not the stillness of someone who is passive, but the stillness of someone who has learned that movement costs energy, and energy is not a thing to waste. Odom did not know that. He did not know a number of things, and he was about to begin learning some of them in a very compressed period of time. She said quietly, "Let go." Not a question, not a plea. A statement delivered in the same register as a weather report. The sky is gray. Let go. Odom didn't let go. He smiled instead, the smile of a man who has mistaken loudness for power and crowd approval for intelligence. His 3 friends at the table were watching. That was part of it. That was most of it. "Relax," he said. "Unjust." He did not finish the sentence. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds and was witnessed by 11 people in Lanigan's Bar and Grill on the south side of Fayetteville, North Carolina, on a Thursday night in October, and every single one of them would later describe it differently, because the human brain, when confronted with something that violates its model of how physics works, has a tendency to fill in the gaps with whatever makes the most sense to it. What they agreed on? She moved. What they disagreed on? How? What none of them could quite explain was why Odom ended up on his knees on the floor with his wrist bent at an angle that made the bartender close his eyes, and why the woman who put him there was already sitting back on her stool, calmly picking up her coffee mug, before anyone in the room had fully processed that anything had happened. Odom made a sound. One of his friends stood up. The woman looked at him. He sat back down. The second friend stood up and got further, made it to the edge of the table, before something in the quality of her attention stopped him the same way a fence stops a dog. Not aggression, not threat, just the absolute pressurized certainty of someone who has already run this calculation and knows the outcome and is waiting with infinite patience for the other person to arrive at the same conclusion. He sat down. Odom pulled himself up from the floor. His wrist was singing. His pride was somewhere he couldn't locate. He looked at her from a distance now, the distance of a man who has just discovered that the territory he thought he was entering is posted and marked and belongs to someone else in ways he doesn't have maps for. "Who are you?" he said. His voice came out smaller than he meant it to. She didn't answer. She finished her coffee. She set a 20 on the bar. She nodded once at the bartender, a retired ranger named Creel, who had seen the kind of things that make a man difficult to surprise, and who was looking at the woman with an expression that wasn't quite recognition but was adjacent to it, the expression of someone who knows a specific language when they hear it spoken, even if they can't identify the dialect. She walked to the door. She pushed it open. She was gone. The bar held its silence for several seconds. Then Odom's friend, the one who'd sat back down at the fence, walked slowly to the bar. He picked up something she'd left behind without anyone noticing, something she'd set down next to the 20 without fanfare or intention that anyone could read. He turned it over in his hand. It was a unit patch. Small, worn, the kind of thing that had been handled so many times the edges had gone soft. The insignia on it was specific, and the man looking at it had spent enough time in and around Fort Bragg to know exactly how specific it was. He put it down very carefully. "Odom," he said. "What?" The friend looked at the door. He looked at the patch. He pressed his lips together. "We need to go." Outside, Dana Reyes walked to her truck in the October cold. She unlocked it. She sat in the driver's seat and gripped the wheel with both hands and breathed in through the nose, hold, out slow, the pattern she'd taught herself to reach for instead of other things. Her right hand, the one she'd used, was completely steady. That was the part that would have alarmed anyone who understood what it meant. Not shaking. Not even slightly. She'd come out tonight because her apartment felt like a held breath. 3 weeks since she'd separated from the army. 3 weeks of silence that had a particular quality she didn't have a name for yet. Not peaceful, not restful, just the silence of a machine that has been running continuously for 9 years and doesn't know what to do with the absence of task. She hadn't wanted a confrontation. She'd driven 40 minutes from her apartment to a bar where nobody knew her specifically to avoid confrontation. She started the truck. She didn't know, as she pulled out of the parking lot, that Creel the bartender had already made a phone call, that the patch she'd left on the bar had been photographed and sent, that the photograph was sitting in someone's inbox who would open it at 6:13 the next morning and go very still for a very long time. She didn't know any of that yet. She just drove home through the dark. And the October road was empty, and somewhere to the south a base she'd spent 9 years attached to was lit up like it always was, like it never stopped, like the work was continuous even when the people doing it weren't. The work was always continuous. That was the thing she hadn't figured out yet, how to live without. Major Gerald Pollard did not sleep well. He hadn't slept well in roughly 2 months, which was roughly how long he'd been sitting on a problem he didn't have a clean solution to. The problem, simplified, was this. He had a unit, a specific kind of unit, the kind that doesn't appear in public-facing military documentation. And the unit had a gap, not a personnel gap, a specific, technical, irreplaceable kind of gap that had opened up when his best long-range shooter had medically separated 8 months ago, and that had not closed since despite 2 rounds of qualification testing and 1 borrowed asset from a sister unit who had, politely, not worked out. Pollard ran joint training assessments for cross-unit readiness evaluations. It was a job that required, among other things, knowing what a problem looked like before it became a casualty, and he had been looking at this particular problem for 2 months and not liking what he saw. He opened his phone at 6014. He read the message from Creel. He looked at the photograph of the patch for a long time. Then he looked up the name attached to the separation record he'd been holding in a pending file for 3 weeks. Because something about it hadn't felt resolved to him. And he'd learned, over 22 years, to pay attention to things that didn't feel resolved. Reyes, Dana M., Staff Sergeant, separated honorably. 9 years of service, qualification record that made the document look like it was bragging. He put his phone down. He picked it up again. He looked at the photograph of the patch. He made a call. The call woke Reyes at 7002. She answered on the second ring because she had not actually been asleep, and not been asleep since around 400, which was increasingly the pattern and which she was increasingly pretending was fine. Staff Sergeant Reyes. The voice on the other end was male, measured, the voice of someone who'd spent long enough in command positions that his default register was 2 notches calmer than a normal person's. "Not anymore," she said. "No," the voice agreed. "But I'd like to talk about that. My name is Pollard. I run a joint training assessment unit out of Bragg. I think there's a conversation worth having." She was quiet for a moment. Outside her window, the October morning was gray and specific and real in the way mornings are when you haven't slept. "How did you get this number?" she said. A brief pause. "You left something at Lanigan's last night." The silence that followed had a particular texture to it. Not surprise, she'd known when she put the patch down that it was a readable gesture, that she was leaving a marker. She hadn't consciously decided what she wanted that marker to communicate, but she had put it down anyway, the way you do a thing that the part of yourself beneath language has already decided on before the thinking part catches up. "What kind of conversation?" she said. She reported to a classified training facility 20 minutes outside Bragg at 0830, not to take a job, to have a conversation, which Pollard had been careful to present as exactly that and nothing more, and which Reyes had accepted on exactly those terms, because she had learned a long time ago that the shape of a thing is as important as its substance, and sometimes is its substance. The facility was the kind of place that exists outside public maps. She'd been here before, for different reasons, in a different capacity. The gate personnel did not exchange pleasantries. She appreciated that. Pollard met her in a briefing room. He was a large man who had the particular stillness of someone who had been physically powerful for a long time and no longer felt the need to demonstrate it. He shook her hand and did not do the thing some men did, of adding pressure or duration to the handshake to measure something. She noticed the absence of it the way you notice a sound that stops. "You were at Lanigan's last night," he said. It was not a question. Yes. There was an incident. There was a resolution, she said. The incident was someone else's. Pollard looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, not amusement, but the specific attention of someone who has heard a distinction that is worth noting. "Yes," he said. "That's actually why I called." He did not address what had happened at the bar directly. What he addressed was the gap, the qualification record, the thing he needed and the reason he needed it. He laid it out with the efficiency of a man who had been making operational cases for a long time and had learned that clarity was a form of respect. When he finished, he said, "I'm not asking you to re-enlist. I'm asking you to consult. 6 weeks. A specific training evolution involving a joint element that has a readiness deficit in exactly the area where you have 9 years of documented expertise." Reyes looked at the table. She thought about her apartment. The silence. The 4 a.m. mornings. The machine running without task. "What's the joint element?" she said. "Army, Rangers. A battalion group currently assigned to pre-deployment readiness assessment." He paused. "Some of them were at Lanigan's last night." The quality of the silence that followed was interesting. It had information in it, not surprise, but the particular stillness of someone taking a fact and placing it next to another fact and understanding what the resulting picture meant. "That's why you called today," she said. "That's one reason," Pollard said. He held her gaze. "The other reason is your qualification record. I'd have called eventually. Last night accelerated the timeline." He paused. "I'd like to know if you're willing." She thought about the patch she'd left on the bar. She thought about the fact that she'd left it. She thought about the 9 years and the particular quality of the silence in her apartment, and the 4TEM and the machine running without task. "Yes," she said. The Rangers arrived at the facility at 0700 the following Monday. 8 of them, 2 vehicles. The particular coordinated casualness of a group of men who had spent enough time moving together that the coordination had become invisible. They were pre-deployment, which meant they were operating at the particular sharpness of people who know they are close to something real and are calibrating everything accordingly. Odom was the 6th one through the door. He did not see her immediately. The briefing room was standard. Metal chairs, projection screen, the institutional quality of a space designed for function. He took a seat in the middle of the group, which was where Odom usually put himself, the position of someone who considers himself the center of gravity in any configuration. The briefing officer, a Navy commander named Braswell, walked them through the parameters. Joint readiness assessment, 5 days. Specific skill evaluation and cross-unit integration. Primary instructor, TBA. Then Braswell clicked the projector. The name on the screen was Staff Sergeant Dana Reyes, USA, retired, Special Operations Marksmanship and Tactical Assessment Instructor. The room processed this at different speeds. Odom's hands went flat on his thighs. The ranger to his left, a sergeant first class named Pell, who was perhaps the most situationally aware person in the group, and who had been the one to photograph the patch and send it to Krell, went very quiet in the specific way of someone who has just confirmed a suspicion they weren't entirely sure they'd wanted, confirmed. The door opened. She walked in. She was in tactical gear now, dark and functional, bearing the quiet precision of equipment selected by someone who uses it. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was composed and entirely neutral. The bruise from Odom's grip on her wrist, faint but present, was visible above her sleeve. No one in the room could look at it without knowing its full context. No one tried to pretend they didn't. She stood at the front and looked at them, not performing authority, not establishing it, just carrying it the way people carry things they've had long enough that the carrying has become part of them. She said in a voice that was calm and clear and required no theatrical weight to land, "Some of you know me from Thursday night. The rest of you will know me by Friday." She let one beat of silence fall. Either way, what you think you know and what is actually true are probably not the same thing. That gap is what we're here to close. She walked one step forward. "My name is Dana Reyes. I have 9 years of special operations service. I've conducted long-range precision operations in environments most people in this room will never be cleared to know about. I hold qualification records in 3 distinct marksmanship disciplines that have not been broken in 7 years. Another step. I am not here to humiliate you. I want to say that plainly. What comes next will feel like humiliation. That feeling is information. Use it." She looked at Odom, not longer than she looked at anyone else. Just an even professional level moment of contact. "Do you believe me?" she said to the room. Silence. "Staff Sergeant Odom," she said. He straightened. "Do you believe me?" He held her gaze. She gave him the full weight of the silence and did not soften it or rush it or offer him an exit. "Yes, ma'am," he said. His voice was different than it had been at Lanigan's. The volume was the same. The architecture underneath it was not. "Good," she said. Then we began. What followed was 5 days of the most methodical, patient, systematically uncomfortable instruction any of them had ever received. And they had received a substantial volume of instruction between their collective deployments. It began with an assessment evolution Reyes described as baseline, a standard land navigation and objective acquisition problem in the facility's training ground. 7 Rangers, full loadout, 30 minutes, 3 objectives. They completed 1. Reyes was at the exit when they came out. She had a notepad and a pen, and she looked at neither. She looked at them. "Where did you lose the second objective?" Pell, who'd been leading, answered, "Rude conflict at the creek crossing." 2 team members read the terrain differently. "Who?" 2 hands. "What did you do?" "Deferred to team leader call." "How long?" "Maybe a minute." "In 1 minute," Reyes said, her voice carrying without being raised. "At a creek crossing with exposed approach angles, every opposing element within visual range has repositioned. Every one." She looked at them. "Go again." They went again. She asked the same kinds of questions after every iteration. Not what went wrong, where exactly, at what second, in which decision, in whose processing. The effect was unsettling in the specific way of a process that forces you to be the one who locates your own error, so there is no one else to blame for it, and no way to argue with the finding. By the 4th iteration, they were getting 2 of 3 objectives. Pell noticed the pattern and stopped at the debrief. "You're running the same problem every time," he said. "You're watching us learn." Reyes looked at him. Something moved in her expression, the specific quality of attention given to a thing worth noting. "Yes," she said. "Why?" "Because knowing where your own system breaks is more valuable than knowing how to run a system that doesn't break." A pause. "Close," she said. "The real answer is, because in the field, you don't get a debrief after every contact. You have to be your own debrief while you're still in it. The only way to build that is to practice it with something that stays the same while you change." She looked at the group. "You're not learning the course. You're learning yourselves." Odom had been quiet for most of the first day. Not sullen. He was too professional for sullen. But processing. Pell had been watching him the way he watched everything, from the corner of his eye, with the peripheral awareness of a man who has long understood that what people do when they think they're not being observed is far more informative than what they do when they know they are. At the lunch break, Odom sat away from the others. Pell brought his tray over and sat across from him without asking. Odom looked up. "I'm going to say I'd rather be alone." "I know," Pell said. He started eating. Silence. The sound of a facility working around them. Then Odom said, without looking up, "She's better than us." Pell considered how to answer that. He settled on the honest one. "In some things, yes. In the things that matter right now. In most of the things that matter right now." Pell put his fork down. Is that the part that's bothering you, or is it the other part? Odom was quiet for a moment. The other part, he said. The part where I... He stopped, picked up his fork, put it back down. The part where what I did on Thursday is visible in this room every minute that she's in it, and there's no way to. He exhaled. There's no version where I get to move past that by doing nothing. Pell said, no, there isn't. So what do I do? Pell looked at him. You work. Today you just work. Odom nodded once. Something in the set of his jaw had changed from what it had been at 0700 this morning. Not repaired. It hadn't been long enough for repair, but oriented. Pointed toward something more honest than what it had been pointed toward before. Across the room, Reyes sat alone with a water bottle and a worn green notebook. She was writing in it, small and precise, and she did not look up. But she had heard everything. Her table was closer than they'd calculated, and her hearing, like most things about her, was not average. She wrote 2 words next to Odom's name and closed the notebook. The second day began at 4:30. No warning. Reyes's voice through the facility intercom, coordinates, a rendezvous time, nothing else. They assembled at the coordinates, a staging area on the west edge of the compound, to find her already there with 8 folders. Inside each folder, a name, a role, behavioral parameters. You are no longer Rangers. You are a mixed element close protection team operating in a denied urban environment, Reyes said. Your asset is a signals intelligence resource being moved under active compromise. Your objective is extraction. Your opposition, she checked her watch, is me. Your head start is 12 minutes. One of the younger Rangers, a specialist named Thorne, 22 years old and operating on 3 hours of sleep and a lot of adrenaline, said, just you? Reyes looked at him with the patience of someone who has heard this question before and understands what it costs the person asking it. 12 minutes, she said. I'd suggest not spending them talking. They spent 11 minutes and 40 seconds moving. They split into 2 elements, established rear security, used counter-surveillance patterns from their collective repertoire. None of it accounted for the fact that she was not behind them. She had been in front of them since 0443. She had studied the compound layout for 2 full days before the assessment began. She knew the choke points, the sight lines, the way the morning light moved across the structures, and where it created blind spots. She knew which positions a Ranger-trained element would instinctively move toward, the high ground, the defensible approach, the angles that made tactical sense, because she understood how that training shaped a mind, and she had planned for every shape it might take. Dorn was the first one taken. He was in transition between 2 positions when she appeared from an angle he had not covered, because his mental model had placed her threat vector behind him. She put him down with a training marker and the time it took him to process that she was there, which was not enough time. He sat where she indicated and stayed sat. When she came for the next one, she came through their frequency. She had been on their frequency since 0449. She told them this while she was still on it. The effect on the element was instructive. Not panic, not anger, but the particular cognitive discomfort of realizing that the frame of the problem is different from the frame you've been operating inside, that the walls are somewhere else. By the 4-hour mark, 4 of the 8 were marked out. Pell, Odom, and 2 others had gone completely dark. Radios off, no movement, the full patience and weight discipline that special operations training hammers into a person at the foundational level. It worked for 39 minutes. Then Odom shifted his weight because his left knee was aching, and Reyes, who had been in a static observation position 11 meters away for the previous 27 minutes, noted the micro-movement and recalculated. She did not move immediately. She waited. She let them believe in their own invisibility for 19 more minutes, because the kind of learning she was after lived inside exactly that gap, the gap between believing you are invisible and being told you are never invisible at all. You cannot teach someone to stop trusting false certainty. You can only make them live inside it long enough that the collapse becomes visceral. Pell felt it first. He put a hand on Odom's arm. 2 fingers. Someone's here. Odom made a decision. Later, Pell would identify this as the first real decision Odom had made in the exercise. Not a reaction, not a reflex. An actual deliberate choice based on assessed information rather than pride or pattern. He picked up his radio. Press transmit. Reyes, he said. 10 seconds. Then Odom. You've had us. For a while. Yes. Why haven't you moved? The silence that followed had a texture to it. She was 11 meters away in the dark, deciding how much honesty the moment required. Because you went silent and held position correctly, she said finally. That was the first time today that any of you stopped reacting and started thinking. I wanted to see if you'd hold it. Odom processed that. How long were you going to wait? As long as it took. What if we hadn't broken? A pause. Then I'd have given you the objective. A team that can hold discipline under genuine pressure is worth giving ground to. A beat. But you broke. He looked at the radio in his hand. Why did I break? Why did you? He thought about the honest answer. Because I needed to know if you were there. Not where, just whether. Quiet on the other end for a moment. That's fear, she said. Not an accusation, a diagnosis. Not the bad kind, the kind that tells you the environment has changed before your eyes can confirm it. But you let it pull you out of discipline. A pause. That's the work. I know. Odom, pal, exercise concluded. Return to staging. Come in. They came in. All four collected the 4 eliminated Rangers along the way. The debrief lasted 2 hours longer than the exercise because that was how Reyes worked, and none of them had expected it. She did not review what had gone wrong generally. She located the specific second for each person, the exact decision, the exact mechanism, the place where each man's particular mind had a gap that his training had not yet closed. When she got to Odom, she paused. 1 beat, maybe 2. In a room where she'd moved through each person with clean efficiency, the pause registered. Odom. Your error was the radio call. But the error before that error was treating stillness as a final state, rather than a position in an ongoing sequence. She looked at him. You can't outlast the patient enemy by being patient. You have to change the shape of the problem. He held her gaze. Find another move. Find another move, she confirmed. The instinct that made you call, the awareness that something had shifted, was correct. The execution was wrong, but the instinct. She paused. Note it. Pell, 2 seats away, watched Odom receive this. He watched something happen in Odom's face that Pell could only describe as the beginning of a recalibration, not dramatic, not a breakdown or revelation, the quiet internal shift of a compass needle finding a new north. The thing that none of them had seen coming arrived on the 3rd evening, after the debrief, after dinner, when the facility had settled into the specific quiet of a place where exhausted people sleep without needing to negotiate with sleep first. Odom sat outside on a concrete step with his wrapped wrist resting on his knee. He heard the door behind him. He did not look. Reyes sat down on the step beside him. Not close. 2 feet of deliberate space. She had her notebook in her hands and was looking at the tree line at the edge of the compound. They sat for a while without speaking. Then Odom said, I'm sorry. She did not answer immediately. Not about the training, he said. He turned to look at her profile. About Thursday night. There's no version of what I did that holds up, and I'm not going to try to build one. She was quiet. Why did you do it? She said finally. He thought about the easy answers, the alcohol, the audience, the ego, the momentum of a night that had been going in a direction. He considered each one and set it aside, because she had spent 3 days teaching him to locate the precise moment in the precise mechanism, and he owed her at least the discipline of applying that to himself. Because you made me feel like I didn't matter, he said, and I didn't know how to sit with that, so I tried to make you matter less. The honesty of it sat between them in the October air. Reyes said, Do you know how many times someone has tried to make me matter less? I can guess, he said. No, she said quietly. You can't. Not bitter. Factual. But what you reached for tells me something about your limits that you should think about. A man with no limits reaches for a weapon. You reached for a wrist and a crowd. She paused. That means somewhere in you there's still a line. The work is learning where it actually belongs. Odom sat with that. The night was quiet. Inside, 6 Rangers slept the sleep of men being methodically taken apart and piece by piece reassembled around something more durable. Reyes stood. She held out her notebook. Page 9, she said. Read it. Give it back before Sarah 500. She went inside. He opened to page 9. In her small, precise handwriting were 2 columns. On the left, dates spanning several years. On the right, single sentences, notes she'd written to herself. Not confessions, not apologies, but the private record of a person working day after day on a single essential problem. How to carry what cannot be put down without becoming something smaller than what you started as. The last entry, dated 3 weeks earlier, read, "You stopped so you could start differently. Don't forget what that took. Don't waste it." He closed the notebook. He sat on the step for a long time. He was not the same man who'd walked into Lanigan's 10 days ago. He couldn't have told you precisely what was different, only that the distance between who he'd been and who he was sitting here in the October dark felt real in a way that didn't require witnesses or documentation. He returned the notebook at 0448. He placed it on the folding table outside the briefing room, spine aligned with the edge, the way you place something that belongs to someone else when you understand its value. He didn't leave a note. He didn't need to. When Reyes arrived at 0500 and saw it there, she picked it up and held it for a moment without opening it. She looked out the window at the dark. Whatever she thought in those seconds, she kept entirely to herself. The final day began at 4:30. No intercom. Reyes came into the bunk room and turned on the overhead light and said, "Up. Last evolution. Everything you have." The final exercise was a full-scale integration scenario, 8 Rangers constituting a direct action element with a specific intelligence recovery objective, opposed by a mixed advisory unit that had been on site since 200 and had the full compound layout memorized. 8 against 8, except Reyes had added 1 parameter she announced at the end of the briefing. "I'm in the field," she said. "Not coordinating. In the field, on their side. My objective is your failure." A pause. "But I have a constraint, they don't. I can only be in one place at a time." She looked at the group. "Use that." Thorne said, very quietly to the man beside him, "She's going to be everywhere." The man beside him said, "I know." They went in at 0500. The tactics Pell had built over 4 days of being systematically taken apart and rebuilt were cleaner than anything they'd run at the start of the week. He split the element into 3 groups. 2 flanking elements moved away from the objective, not toward it, their purpose not to advance, but to create noise that required response. The center element, Odom, Thorne, a ranger named Straker, moved quietly through the corridor the flanks opened. They were 11 minutes in when Odom heard something that wasn't quite a sound. He stopped. "Fist up. Mason." Her voice came from his left, low, close. She was 6 feet away and had been there for at least the previous 30 seconds. He turned. He looked at her. He thought, she's announcing herself. She has the position and she's announcing herself instead of using it. That's a choice. That choice contains information. She wants my eyes on her. "Don't look at me," he said quietly, to Thorne, to Straker. "Find what she's not showing us." Straker turned, swept the north approach, stopped, contact, 1 element, static position, north corridor, 30 meters, static, waiting for them to come around the building. Set up for perimeter engagement, not internal, not expecting anyone to move toward the threat. Odom looked at Reyes. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Not approval, not its absence. Something more neutral than both. The expression of someone who has set a problem in motion and is watching to see where it lands. He picked up his radio. "Pell. East flank holding." "Holding. 2 minutes. Center element is going north. Through the building." A pause from Pell. Through. The next 3 minutes were the cleanest work Odom had done in the exercise. No hesitation, no ego in the movement, just the clear application of everything that had been stripped away and rebuilt over 4 days around a different understanding of what it meant to move correctly. They went through the north building, through the gap in the static element's interior coverage, out the north exit, to the objective point in 41 seconds, ahead of the sweep that would have closed the corridor around them if they'd been 30 seconds slower. When the exercise concluded and the joint debrief began, the advisory unit coordinator, a master sergeant named DeBrow, who had run this scenario across 3 years and 2 continents, looked at Odom and said, "Nobody's gone through the building before, in 47 iterations." Odom said nothing. He looked at Reyes. She was writing in her notebook. She did not look up. She said, "He changed the frame." Dubrow looked at her, then at Odom. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man revising a model he'd already built. That night, Odom sat outside again on the same concrete step. He heard the door. He did not look. Reyes sat down. Same distance. Same notebook. "The deposition," he said. She looked at him. "Pell told me, the inquiry about your qualification record. The formal review board claiming your long-range results were misattributed, that the scores were entered under your designation by administrative error and actually belonged to a male operator in your former unit." He paused. "That the record is yours in name only." Reyes was very still. "Pell has a contact," Odom said. "Someone who was present at the original qualification events, 3 qualification events over 2 years. Someone who watched you shoot and signed the documentation." He looked at her. "They're willing to provide a statement." She looked at him for a long time. Something moved behind her eyes that she had not let move in front of anyone all week. The specific expression of a person who has been carrying something alone long enough that the appearance of unexpected support requires a moment to simply be real before it can be processed. "That record is mine," she said. "I know," he said. "I earned every number on it." "I know that too." She was quiet. "They've been building this review for 8 months. Since I separated. Someone in the unit who had a problem with what I was." She stopped herself. Looked at the tree line. "They couldn't take it while I was in, so they waited." Odom sat with that. The specific ugliness of it. The patience of it. The precision of targeting someone's record, someone's documented proof of what they were, as the means of erasure. "Pell made calls 3 days ago," Odom said. "The contact has already submitted a sworn statement to the oversight office. 2 others have corroborated it. People who were there." Reyes turned to look at him. "The review board gets the statements in the morning," he said, "before the panel convenes." She was very still for a long time. Then she said quietly, "He signed the documentation himself, the one who filed the review. He was the range officer at 2 of the 3 qualifications." A pause. "He knows what he watched." "Yes," Odom said. "And now 3 other people are on record saying what they watched too." The silence that followed was not empty. It had weight and direction and the specific quality of something that has been compressed for a long time, finding the first available release. She said, "There's a woman in my former unit, 24 years old, qualified 18 months ago. If they could do this to my record, they'll try it with hers eventually." She looked at the tree line. "That's the part I couldn't." She stopped. "I wasn't going to go quietly because of her, because of what it would mean if I did." Odom said, "You didn't go quietly. No. You left a patch on a bar." She looked at him. "You knew what you were doing," he said. "When you left it, you knew someone might know what it was." She was quiet for a moment. "I knew someone might," she said. "I didn't know who." Odom turned the wrapped wrist over on his knee. The physical fact of it, the consequence, that would take weeks to heal and had been in the room every day of that week as a reminder of what he'd been and what it had cost. He reached into his jacket pocket. He held something out on his palm. It was a small coin, worn and specific, the edges soft from handling. His grandfather's Army Distinguished Service Medal, the one he'd carried since the funeral 6 years ago, the one that had meant something once and that he had been, slowly, carrying like an accessory rather than a weight. "My grandfather's," he said. He looked at it. "He told me once that the test of a man isn't what he does when people are watching. It's what he does when he thinks no one is." He paused. "I've been failing that test for a while. I think you know that." He kept his hand extended. "I'd like you to hold this until I've done enough to deserve it back." Reyes looked at the coin. She looked at him. She picked it up. She held it between her fingers for a moment, then placed it in her jacket pocket next to her notebook. She looked at him with the expression of someone making a commitment they intend to keep. "Then come back having done enough," she said. "Not a wish. A requirement." The specific words of a person who means exactly what they say and expects to be held to it. Odom nodded. Once. Clean. He had known this week what it felt like to be the worst version of himself and to have someone refuse to let that be the final version. He had known what it felt like to be stripped down past the noise and the performance and the accumulated weight of everyone's expectations, including his own, down to something smaller and more honest and more workable than what he'd walked in with. He would deploy in 3 weeks. He would come back. He would not be the same man who had grabbed a wrist across a bar because he couldn't tolerate being made to feel small. The coin was in her pocket. He had a reason now that was about more than himself. The review board convened at 0900 the following morning. The 3 sworn statements were on the record before the panel opened. The range officer who had filed the review, the one who had signed the documentation himself, and then 8 months later claimed the documentation was wrong, sat across the table from 2 oversight officers and a legal advisor, and did not have an answer for why the other 3 witnesses remembered the events the way they did, which was the same way the original documentation recorded them. The review concluded at 11:43. The finding was 3 sentences. The qualification record stood as documented. The filing was dismissed. The case was closed. Reyes read the notification on her phone at 12:01. She was standing in the parking lot of the facility. She read it once. She put her phone in her pocket. She looked at the sky for a moment, the specific gray of a November morning that had decided it was going to be exactly what it was, and not apologize for it. Then the door behind her opened and Pell came out, and behind him the rest of them, all 8, in the particular unhurried quality of people who had nowhere else to be right now. Odom was carrying 2 paper cups. He held one out. She looked at it, then at him, then at the 7 men standing in a parking lot in November having decided, without coordinating it, that this was where they were going to be this morning. She took the cup. It was gas station coffee from somewhere close enough to still be warm. It was not good coffee. It existed primarily as a vehicle for warmth and for the acknowledgement, which was its own kind of language. That warmth was needed and that they were the ones who had showed up to provide it. She drank it anyway. They stood in the parking lot for a few minutes, all 9 of them, in the particular quiet that exists when something significant has finished and whatever comes next hasn't declared itself yet. Then Pell said, "What happens now?" Reyes turned the cup in her hands. She thought about the apartment, the silence pressing in from every direction, the machine running without task. She thought about the 24-year-old in her former unit who was going to need someone in her corner. She thought about the notebook. The entry from 3 weeks ago, the one about starting differently. She said, "Paul offered me a permanent position. Formal instruction. I wasn't going to take it." She paused. "I changed my mind." "What changed it?" Odom said. She thought about how to answer. She thought about what it had meant to spend 5 days refusing to let 8 men be the worst versions of themselves, what it had cost her and what it had given her, and which of those things was worth continuing toward. She said, "I was reminded what the work actually is." She said it quietly, and it landed the way things land when they are completely true and need nothing around them. Odom looked at his coffee cup. He thought about his grandfather. He thought about a coin in a jacket pocket that he would have to earn back. He thought about the specific distance between the man he'd been at the start of this week and the man standing here now, which was not a large distance in time and was a very large distance in every other measurement that mattered. The November morning was gray and cold and real. They finished the coffee. The group broke up the way groups break up when the thing that assembled them has completed itself. Reyes was the last one to her truck. She sat in the driver's seat. She took out her notebook. She turned to a new page. She wrote 1 line. She looked at it for a moment. Then she started the truck and drove toward what came next. Not away from anything. She had learned a long time ago that driving away was not the same as moving forward, that the difference was the direction of your attention and where you had decided the work still lived. The work still lived ahead. It always did.